Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm Dr. Hope Ferdosian. I'm an internal medicine, preventive medicine, and public health doc at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine and president and CEO of Phoenix Zones Initiative, or PZI. PZI advances the rights, health, and well-being of people, animals, and the planet through education, research, and advocacy. PZI is delighted to host this event on ecological justice and the right to health. This evening, we're joined by our co-sponsors, Brighter Green, the Center for Bioethics and Humanities at Upstate Medical University, the Health and Human Rights Journal, NYU Animal Studies, and Vermont Law School. Before we share more about why we're here tonight, we'd like to give each of our panelists, who you see here on screen, an opportunity to introduce themselves. Elan, would you mind getting us started?
Hi, I'm Elan. I'm an outgoing visiting assistant professor of environmental studies at New York University, and soon to be assistant professor of the practice of environmental studies at Wesleyan University.
Thanks, Elan. Great to have you here. Sid?
And I'm Sid Johnson, and I'm a philosopher, bioethicist, and neuroethicist at the Center for Bioethics and Humanities at Upstate Medical University. I'm interested in brains of every kind and shape and size, and on neuroscientific research. And as an animal ethicist, I'm also interested in pushing bioethics and neuroethics to be less anthropocentric. And I'm interested in overthrowing human exceptionalism and human supremacy.
Thank you, Sid. Mia?
Yes, good evening, everyone, and thanks for everyone for being here, wherever time zone you're in. I'm Mia MacDonald. I'm based in New York City. I run a public policy action tank, Brighter Green, and we work at the intersection of environment and animal protection with a focus on equity and rights. Thank you.
Thanks, Mia. Jeff?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here, and thanks to the organizers for organizing. My name is Jeff Sebo. I'm a clinical associate professor of environmental studies and affiliated professor of bioethics, medical ethics, philosophy, and law, and director of the animal studies MA program at New York University. And I work on issues related to the moral and legal and political status of non-humans, as well as the interactions between animal welfare, global health, and the environment.
Thanks, Jeff. Lori?
Hi, everyone. My name is Lori Sellers. I am a very recent graduate of New York University's MA in Animal Studies program. And this summer, I will be joining Yale Law School's Law, Ethics, and Animals program as a postgraduate fellow. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Lori. And Delphi?
Hello, it's great to be here. I am a professor at Vermont Law School, where I established and direct the Animal Law and Policy Institute, which trains future leaders in animal advocacy and centers animals in the fight for environmental protection. And for the last few years, my scholarship and advocacy both have focused on the deregulation of slaughter and the interconnected interests of animals in the environment and humans in that context, which is what I'll be talking about tonight.
Thanks, Delphi. Thank you all to our panelists for being here tonight. This is a real treat because every single one of our panelists this evening is someone that I love to listen to and learn from. And so it's really, really wonderful to have all of you in one place this evening. This panel was organized after the publication of a special section on ecological justice and the right to health in the Health and Human Rights Journal, which PZI helped publish as a member of the Harvard Ethics v. Health and Human Rights Consortium. As a guest editor in the introductory editorial, I wrote about how the climate emergency, the COVID-19 pandemic, and many other existential threats plainly illustrate in real time how the rights, health, and well-being of humans, other animals, plants, and our shared environment are connected and really interdependent. The panelists who are here with us expanded on those issues in their papers for the journal, and you'll hear much more about these topics tonight. or this afternoon, or this morning, wherever you may be. Ecology is all about relationships, relationships between humans, other animals, and the rest of the natural world. Ecological justice is all about whether or not those relationships are just or fair. The right to health was legally recognized as a human right in 1966, 20 years after the Constitution of the World Health Organization defined health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease. Today, it's clear that human health is impossible to achieve without human rights, and in fact, much has been written about that issue. It's also impossible to achieve human health without attention to the health of non-human beings, and more is being written and said about that issue. But as our panelists this evening will discuss, non-human animals also have a right to health in their own right. This year marks the 60th anniversary of the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. This is my old and worn copy. She offered an ecological view of health and challenged the idea that humans are separate from nature. She showed how health threats to non-human animals served as a warning of environmental destruction and as a foreshadow of what could befall humans. Fortunately, public health perspectives increasingly, they almost have to, emphasize links between the health and well-being of humans, other animals, and the environment. One example is the One Health framework, which we'll talk a bit about tonight, that promotes collaboration among those working in human and veterinary medicine, environmental conservation, public health, and many other fields. But that concept, that One Health concept, has come under some scrutiny for being too human-centered and for failing to see the importance of human and non-human rights and justice in determining health. And that's why at PZI, we focus on a just One Health approach, because we believe health can only be achieved through justice. That's important to human beings, and it's also important to non-human beings. One of the things that I love about Rachel Carson is that she often returned to the importance of a sense of wonder, of curiosity and excitement about the beauty of the world, of each other and of other beings, even in the midst of all the challenges that she plainly saw. My hope is that we can tap into that sense of wonder and that sense of beauty to inspire solutions to the interdependent challenges that we face today, challenges that we face, that other animals face, that our planet faces. So with that, let me please ask Mia to get us started by sharing how the COVID-19 pandemic in particular has provided lessons for potential ways forward.
Thanks so much, Hope, for that really excellent introduction. It almost goes without saying that by any measure, this COVID-19 pandemic has been a disaster. US now surpassing 1 million deaths, likely 15 million deaths globally and counting. Obviously long-term effects too, long COVID, but also economic, food security, education, mental and physical health disruptions and ructions. And I think we're at a place now as we gather again on Zoom where, in the third year of this, many of us, many policymakers and others kind of want to move on, but without fully acknowledging the trauma that this has created and also what should change in the future. How do we prevent this from happening again? And I think we would all agree that no one wants to go through this again if we can avoid it. So in my article, what I argue is that this is a real wake-up call, as if we need another one amidst the climate crisis, the biodiversity loss crisis, massive inequalities in many, many parts of our societies and our relationship with the environment and non-human animals, but is that we need a new relationship with the non-human world. And that the pandemic, while no one would have wanted it to happen, it is an opportunity to really explore, and more than explore, really forge links across issues and sectors. So while we're looking towards preparedness for the next pandemic, we're also really looking at preventing the next pandemic. So what we know is that pandemics emerge from, by and large, how we interact with the non-human world, whether that's animals or ecosystems. We know that zoonoses, diseases that transmitted from animals to humans, account for 70% of emerging infectious diseases around the world. Zoonoses occur because of increased human encroachment on the natural habitat of wildlife, as well as breeding, confinement, consumption of animals, both wild and domesticated. And while we don't know the precise origin of COVID-19, there's some very good evidence that it did emerge, likely from animals that had been bred, likely wild animals to begin with, bred for human consumption with a transmitting animal. Perhaps it's a bat. And we know that zoonoses can also arise from the ways that many of us in the West and increasingly around the world consume and raise and consume animals, from things like factory farming. That's documented, right? And even as COVID has consumed most of our lives for 2.5 years, we've seen outbreaks of avian flu, outbreaks of swine flu that have obvious consequences for human societies and also massive consequences for domesticated animals who are depopulated or slaughtered in ways that I think Delcy will probably talk about in a little bit. So we have 80 billion animals, land animals, that we're raising and slaughtering for food every year, trillions more in the ocean. And we know that some of these are really vectors for zoonoses and future pandemics. So what do we do? And the other thing that I'm also struck by is this isn't really a closely held secret. So a report on preventing the next pandemic that was published in June 2020 by the UN Environment Program and the International Livestock Research Institute declared, quote, "Pandemics such as the COVID-19 outbreak are a predictable and predicted outcome of how people source and grow food, trade and consume animals, and alter environments." And yet here we are in the third year of the pandemic, and what I see in the public narrative, and I imagine my colleagues will agree, is much more focus on preparedness for a future pandemic. Obviously crucial. We want to save lives. We want to avoid horrible inequities in health systems and health outcomes. But I think the focus on how do we prevent this from happening again, and what is the benefit of that for us in the non-human world, and what does that mean for our relationship with the non-human world? I think that part of the narrative and part of the policy making really needs more attention. I also saw a data point, and I think I have this in the article, that even to prevent pandemics by protecting habitats, by stopping wildlife trade, by not investing more in factory farming systems would cost a paltry 2% of the trillions of dollars in financial damage that can be attributed to COVID-19. So I found this quote when I was doing the research for the article that I really like, by Sunara and Astra Taylor, and some of you will know them as really terrific theorists and writers and activists. And they say, quote, "To respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, we need to broaden our political imaginations. Our conception of solidarity must cross the species barrier." And that's my main message for tonight. Let us see, how do we grapple with this? How do we wrestle with this? And then I do want to respond to Hope's question of where are some opportunities, where are some things happening already in terms of policy space, in terms of research, in terms of collaboration, where we can get out of our silos, where we don't have to be an expert in everything, but where people who work on public health, people who work on protection, people who work on animal rights, people who work on deforestation issues and biodiversity protection can actually come together and create and advocate for a shared policy agenda, again, with different entry points, with different emphases, but not to lose the sense of how do we prevent this? And so in the work that I'm involved in, I see those as also engaging with the climate and biodiversity emergencies, new interdisciplinary collaborations across environmental and climate policy, agriculture and food systems, biodiversity and forest protections, obviously intersecting with public health, as well as human rights and animal welfare and animal rights. Those can be really important areas for exchange of information, solidarity, and also practice on the ground. So some of this is happening. I think many of us in our different spheres of influence need to be promoting this more, but there are more of these cross-sectoral engagements taking place. There is a World Health Organization now treaty on preventing pandemics and stopping them at the source, as well as obviously really preparing health systems and populations. I know Hope is involved in some of that work. And there was some very good advocacy done by animal protection groups to really push in the direction of prevention of pandemics, not just preparing for. There is a Preventing Pandemics Commission that is very cross-sectoral. So a report came from a commission convened by Harvard University. That commission now sits at the Rockefeller Foundation. And I think there are a lot of opportunities within these settings for really more collaboration across sectors. There is a new emerging convention on animal protection that some of you may have heard about that a group of lawyers are working on. And the kernel of that idea really does come from COVID-19 and saying, come on, we need to wake up, we need to change how we treat the non-human world. So what does success in this space look like? I mean, I think that's a really in-process discussion, but I think to really have systemic change, there will be some disruptions. There will need to be bridging of divides that have separated human and non-human health and rights, have limited some of these intersections, collaborations, real policy development between public health, broad issues of environment, including climate, animal welfare, and also rights broadly conceived. I would just want to end by saying some of these disruptions, some of these new ways of thinking and action, they will be destabilizing in certain ways for certain groups, for certain interests, for certain policymakers, for certain policy processes. But I would say the urgency of resolving the staggering scale of the ecological crisis, advancing justice and rights, it really does demand new theory, new action. This decade, and we're already getting into this decade, right? As climate scientists tell us, or we really will be too far down the road of catastrophic planetary warming. And we know we've done incredible damage to the non-human world, and that's done a lot of damage to human societies as well. So I think there is a lot of opportunity. It's not easy, but that this is a real area where we need narratives, research, collaborations, policy development. And I hope that many of you on this webinar will be engaged in that. And I know that many of my colleagues are already. So I will pause there and hand back to Hope.
Thank you, Mia. Mia, you mentioned a number of zoonotic diseases or emergent zoonotic diseases, and earlier Sid pointed out that just today in the Washington Post and in other outlets, there is mention of the first monkeypox case in the US as well. Mia, you also mentioned the Pandemic Prevention Treaty. At PZI, we sent a letter from the medical and public health community earlier today to Dr. Tedros at the WHO, supporting efforts to focus on primary prevention, including the problems you spoke about, Mia. Elan, I'd like to turn to you. In your paper, you and Delphi draw on the pandemic to argue for a rights-centered regulatory framework in the US that recognizes the interconnected interest of humans, other animals, and the environment. Your paper talks about slaughter, and it followed the release of a memorandum by the US House of Congress Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis, which revealed that COVID-19 infections and deaths among workers at the time of its publication were 3 times higher in 5 of the largest meatpacking companies than originally estimated. And your paper also followed reports about animals being killed in even greater numbers en masse on industrial farms during the pandemic. So Elan, if I could turn it over to you to talk a little bit about the proposal that you and Delphi have suggested.
So yeah, talk about some of the many ways the regulatory framework fails, and then I'll pass it over to Delphi about what our proposal is. And this report released by the U.S. House Representative Select Subcommittee highlighted a real failure in public as far as COVID was concerned in the slaughterhouse industry. And many factors contributed to this public health disaster. In our article, and the long history of failed oversight of the animal slaughter industry in the United States is Beyond its in slaughterhouses is the failure negatively affects workers, animals, and the environment in multiple other ways. So I'll highlight some of those now. Slaughterhouses are incredibly dangerous places to work. Slaughterhouse workers work elbow to elbow, engaged in fast, repetitive movements with sharp tools. Reports of amputations and hospitalizations are really high. As the National Law Project recently noted, according to reported industry data, and this data is always recognized to be an undercoming from the industry itself, quote, meat and poultry workers are injured at rates on average 50% higher than all other workers in the private sector, with injury rates in red meat plants running almost twice as high, end quote. Injuries aren't only more prevalent though, they're also more severe. So even when compared to other dangerous industries, they're more severe and more prevalent. An industry response to the pandemic that we were just talking about is again illustrative of the general disregard for worker safety. So despite the high risks posed to workers and their communities, slaughterhouses existed providing even the most basic protections during the early months of the pandemic. A Washington Post investigation found that 3 of the largest meat processors in the United States, quote, to provide protective gear to all workers, and some employees say they were told to continue in crowded plants even while sick, end quote. The government agencies that are supposed to protect workers from these harms failed to do so, and worse, at least with the pandemic, in some instances, they actively facilitated harms. So the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, denied an emergency petition to protect slaughterhouse workers and drastically reduced inspections. They refused to inspect slaughterhouses even in the face of repeated serious COVID-19 related complaints. And meanwhile, the Center for Disease Control softened safety recommendations in response to industry pressure. Slaughterhouses also inflict serious harm. Slaughter is a resource-intensive, waste-extensive business. And furthermore, like its impact on workers, its environmental impacts are disproportionately borne by low-income communities, particularly communities of color. Federal data show that almost half of the houses in the United States are in communities with more than 30% of their residents living beneath the poverty line, which is more than twice the national level. And a third are in places where at least 3% of the residents are people of color. Slaughterhouses in the United States, billions of gallons of water annually, discarding used polluted water directly in the waterways. The slaughterhouse pollutants also enter into drinking water supplies via runoff and groundwater fields where the air. Result attacks, autoimmune disorders, bacterial infections, birth defects, cognitive impairment in children, cancers, gastrointestinal problems, miscarriages. These wastewater pollutants also cause algal blooms and dead zones in bodies of water like lakes and even the Gulf of Mexico. These are both fatal to aquatic life and dangerous to human health. Slaughterhouses also create large amounts of air pollution that can cause serious health problems and, of course, are a significant contributor to climate change. Nonetheless, the USDA refuses to consider the environmental impacts of its slaughterhouse policies, and many slaughterhouses routinely violate even the lax federal environmental standards with impunity. So in the very few cases where fines were imposed, they were a minuscule fraction of the potential penalties. And this basically makes the issuing fines an excessive business for the slaughterhouses. But the most immediate and perhaps or arched suffering caused by slaughterhouses is inflicted on the animals themselves. The Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, or the HMSA, makes slaughterhouses handle and kill livestock humanely. However, Sdgs has interpreted this law to apply only to mammals. So that includes birds, who are the vast majority of land animals who are killed for food, from even these basic protections. The agency purports to require humane handling and slaughter of birds under the Products Inspection Act. But stated policy is to take action only if inhumane handling or slaughter rises to the level of what they call a process control issue. So if it's like systemic at the slaughterhouse. This means that the USDA does not require humane treatment on a bird-by-bird basis, only if there is an ongoing pattern or trend of inhumane handling or slaughter. As a result, repeatedly documented throwing, even ripping their bodies from their legs, as well as allowing fully conscious chickens to enter scald tanks intended to remove feathers from dead birds. But because they're still alive, these of them annually, according to die from scalding or asphyxia. So all of this is without enforcement actions from the USDA. And despite the HMSA, mammals also experience severe suffering at slaughterhouses. This includes being fully conscious when having their throat slit, when entering, and even when they're being dismembered. USDA's own Office of Inspector General has repeatedly condemned the agency's poor enforcement of the HMSA, concluding that it, quote, lacks assurances that inspectors working at slaughterhouse establishments are ensuring that animals are humanely treated, end quote. So these are just some of the significant ways in which the different regulations to prevent significant harms to humans, animals, and the environment. And now I'm going to go over to Delcy to discuss the sort of legal problems or the administrative problems with the way that regulation is carried out now, and is for potentially addressing that. Delcy.
Thank you, Elan. So I'm going to start with sharing some updates with you, some important things that have happened since we published our paper in the Harvard Health and Human Rights Journal. And then I'm going to turn to a discussion of why the U.S. Department of Agriculture is fundamentally unsuited to providing meaningful regulatory oversight of the slaughter industry and oversight that recognizes the interconnected interests of humans, other animals, and the environment. And then finally, I will discuss what we propose as an alternative regulatory framework. So 1 week ago today, the House of Representatives Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis, the same subcommittee that released that previous report that was mentioned, released yet another scathing report about the slaughter industry and the U.S. Department of Agriculture's failure to protect workers in that industry. So what this latest report showed, which was based on the review of about 150,000 documents, as well as interviews with many stakeholders, was extensive coordination between, on the one hand, the meat and poultry industry, and on the other, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, specifically intended to protect profits at the cost of basic worker health and safety. And so to anyone who's been paying attention for the last few decades even, it's no surprise that the meat and poultry industry is putting profits above everything else. It's also, to anyone who's been paying attention, not a surprise that the U.S. Department of Agriculture is putting industry profits above everything else, including literally worker lives, as well as public health, animal protection, and other things. But it shouldn't be that way, and we should not throw up our hands and accept that it is this way. I'd like to share a few of the findings from this latest report with you, just to show how devastating the situation has gotten. So one of the findings is that the Undersecretary of Food Safety, a top official within the USDA, quote, was viewed as a go-to fixer in blocking attempts by other regulators to improve health and safety conditions in meatpacking plants. This same high-up official gave her personal email and personal cell phone number to industry representatives in a deliberate attempt to thwart even transparency laws, the ability to get, under the Freedom of Information Act, documentation of her coordination with industry. The industry also enlisted this official to block attempts by a local health department to suspend operations at a Foster Farms slaughterhouse after Foster Farms had for months refused to recommend COVID precautions and disguised death counts as, quote, resolved COVID cases in county reporting. So they were saying that cases had been resolved, but the way that they were resolved was because the workers in the slaughterhouses died. This report also revealed, which ProPublica previously revealed in 2020, that the executive order that Trump issued to keep slaughterhouses open during the pandemic, again, plainly intended to protect profits at all other costs, was drafted by the meat industry, specifically by attorneys for Tyson. This report concludes with the following sentence. To prevent a recurrence of these harms, it is important that agencies work together and state governments, it is important that agencies work with each other and state governments to develop crisis plans that will guard against industry-captured agencies, such as Trump's USDA, exploiting their authority to advance private corporate interests at the expense of public health. And so the U.S. Department of Agriculture has been complicit in actively collaborating with USDA to protect profits. But unfortunately, this is not something that is limited to, quote, Trump's USDA, which is very much the focus of this current report. This is an issue that has persisted across administrations for decades within the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and it's an issue that persists currently under the Biden administration. The Biden administration is actively deregulating slaughter for both pigs and chickens, which is causing tremendous harm to animals, workers, and the environment of the types of harm that Elan described. And so we can't simply call for some piecemeal fixes to how the U.S. Department of Agriculture addresses these issues. We need to do something really fundamentally different. And there's some fundamental reasons why the U.S. Department of Agriculture is ill-equipped to actually provide the oversight that's needed of slaughter. One is that the agency's primary mandate is to promote agriculture. That is its task, first and foremost. It is an agency that provides what it refers to as services to what it refers to as customers. It does not see itself as a true regulatory agency that provides oversight to protect public health, to protect animals, to protect the environment. It is protecting an industry. That is its mandate. As such, anything you ask it to do that conflicts with that mandate is going to get a backseat at best. As a result, it's no surprise that the USDA declares itself exempt from even being required to consider environmental impacts under the National Environmental Policy Act when it's looking at slaughterhouse issues, despite the well-documented evidence that they have significant environmental impacts. It's no surprise that they're disregarding workers and actively trying to sabotage the interests of workers, and that they're not protecting animals. It's not surprising that they're not coordinating in a meaningful way with the agencies like the EPA and OSHA, who do have primary mandates over these other concerns. It's baked into the system. And so we cannot keep going to the USDA and asking them to do this and scratching our heads and wondering why they're not doing it. Yes, they are legally required to do much more than they should. Yes, we should continue to try to hold them accountable. But ultimately, if we're going to see meaningful change, we need to take a step back and look at an entirely different regulatory framework. And that is what we've proposed in our article. What we have proposed as a harm reduction measure, because we recognize that in order to truly mitigate the harms that we're talking about, industrial slaughter must end. It cannot be maintained in a way that truly protects workers, animals, and the environment. But there are ways to really significantly mitigate these harms to make sure that we aren't knowingly letting workers get sick with COVID and die because we can't bother to protect them. That we're not knowingly perpetuating a system that allows about 1 million birds to die in scald tanks every year while fully conscious. We can do a lot to make this a less bad system. And we think that taking a One Health approach that is modified by also incorporating concepts of rights and justice to give it more teeth and to recognize that there are fundamental protections that animals, humans, and the environment are entitled to, can provide a framework that we can then take and apply to looking at how to regulate this industry. And what we have suggested is the creation of a federal regulatory oversight commission, a slaughter oversight commission, that uses as its framework a modified One Health approach with consideration of rights and justice to look at slaughterhouses and to look at the fundamentally inextricable ways that human, animal, and environmental interests are intertwined, and to regulate with an eye towards those intertwined interests rather than trying to piecemeal address only worker interests, only environmental interests, or, as is too often the case, protecting profits for industry. There are examples of this sort of oversight commission approach in our history in the US. The Marine Mammal Commission is one of them. There was a Civil Rights Commission that took a similar approach. And what we're proposing is a bit different than what has happened historically, because we are really pushing an interdisciplinary approach. And there hasn't been a commission that really took a meaningful One Health approach and looked at an interagency coordination approach. But never before in history has there been a situation that screamed out for recognition of the interconnectedness of these interests as our current historical moment, and specifically as the situation with slaughterhouses and the tremendous harms that slaughterhouses, industrial slaughterhouses specifically, are inflicting. And so ultimately, we need an entirely new agency, but a commission is a way to get us in that direction. A commission is something that can study the issue, can make recommendations, and really importantly, can gather information. The select subcommittee has gathered a lot of really damning information, but unfortunately, I'm quite certain that it's just the tip of the iceberg. If we start digging, we're going to find a lot more. And there are NGOs doing incredible work in this space, and we rely on their work in our paper. We cite it extensively. I've been working in an incredible coalition of animal, environmental, worker, consumer protection groups, and the coalitions that are coming together around these issues, and Mia's comments made me think of it, are just amazing and have so much potential. But the government, with a subpoena power, has a lot more ability to gather information and to make authoritative recommendations if you bring together a panel of experts in that format. So that is our recommendation. I want to be very clear that it is a harm reduction method, that there are tensions, fundamental tensions about talking about rights and justice in the context of slaughter, because it is fundamentally exploitative, but there are ways to mitigate the harms that are being inflicted. And it can be used as a model to think about how we might regulate in a more holistic way that recognizes the ways in which human interests are intertwined with the interests of the animals and the environment that we inhabit. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Delphi. And we will talk more about some of those tensions a little bit later in our discussion, and we will also have time for Q&A. I see some terrific questions popping up in the comment section and the question section, so please continue to add your questions if you would. We'll do our best to tackle them a little bit later. Delphi and Elan provided an approach that's both practical, as Delphi mentioned, and aspirational, to be frank, in a system in which workers are visible to the law only through their labor, and a system in which non-human animals are visible to the law only upon their death. Jeff, in your paper, you, Lori, and Kimberly argue for radical changes in policy, if I can call them that, and that the right to health ultimately requires moving beyond the instrumentalism of humans and other animals. What do you mean by that?
Hey, thank you so much, Hope, and to everybody else. Lori and I worked with our colleague Kimberly Bernotas on this paper about animals and a right to health, and we thought Lori could take the lead and discuss how animals were impacted, both directly and indirectly, during COVID-19, and then I can discuss some of the takeaways. So Lori, do you want to talk about the animal impacts?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Hope. So what I think has become very clear from COVID-19, right, is, as many of the other panelists have alluded to, the fact that human health and non-human health are inextricably mixed. And of course, while we all are very aware that the pandemic has resulted in significant impacts on human populations, it's also the case that non-humans have been impacted as well in really significant ways. But what's interesting about these impacts is that various groups of non-human animals have both appeared to have benefited from the pandemic, but also appear to have been harmed by the pandemic as well. Animals have been affected directly by COVID-19 by contracting the virus, either incidentally or being intentionally infected by humans for the sake of research, but they've also been affected indirectly, primarily due to human-related disruptions because of the pandemic. And so this evening, I'm going to touch on just some examples of these impacts on some non-human animal populations. I'll talk a little bit about farmed animals and wild animals in particular. But what I would like to note is just that this is by no means an exhaustive review of the ways in which non-humans have been affected. And since the pandemic is ongoing, we're still developing our understanding of the exact extent and nature of these effects. So starting with farmed animals, I think perhaps the most infamous example of a non-human population affected by COVID-19 might be minks who are farmed for fur. Minks have been directly impacted by COVID because they can contract and die from this respiratory disease. It's estimated, in fact, that millions of minks became infected with COVID-19 since the onset of the pandemic, and an estimated 700,000 of them died from infection alone. And it's worth noting that it's conditions on mink fur farms that facilitate the rapid spread of a respiratory disease by keeping minks in crowded, cramped conditions in open wire cages. But minks also suffered very significantly because of the pandemic's indirect effects on them. Once it was discovered, for example, that humans could pass COVID to mink and then that mink could pass it back to humans, many governments where minks are farmed for fur in large numbers ordered the mass extermination of mink populations in their borders. The most famous example of this was in Denmark, which ordered the extermination of all 17 million individual mink in their country at the end of 2020. And of course, it's not just minks or animals farmed for fur who have been impacted as well. As Elan and Delcy were describing, the COVID-19 pandemic caused significant disruptions in the US slaughterhouse system. And when many animals, particularly chickens and pigs, were not able to be sent to slaughter, many farmers resorted to brutal methods to kill their populations of animals as well, by gassing, electrocuting, shooting them, and subjecting them to ventilation shutdowns. And now, all of these effects on farmed animals are horrific. But it's also worth noting, I think, that it seems that in some ways the pandemic might be benefiting at least future populations of some farmed animals. For example, the situation with mink contracting COVID-19 appears to have inspired some countries like France and the Netherlands to ban mink farming in the future. But it's not just animals who we tend to think of as being under the strictest kind of human control who are impacted by COVID. Wild animals as well have felt the effects of the ongoing pandemic. I'm sure we all heard some of the really fantastic stories of wildlife reclaiming human-dominated spaces at the beginning of the lockdowns. And while some of those stories were overblown, it's also true that some animals like birds, bees, whales, and animals who find themselves near human roadways benefit from a quieter planet. With quieter skies, quieter oceans, and fewer vehicles on the road, some of these animals benefited from COVID lockdowns. But on the other hand, a decrease in human activity also appears to have harmed some other wild animal populations in other ways. For example, the drop in global tourism meant that areas reliant on tourist fees to fund conservation law enforcement saw a decline in income. And many of those areas also saw an intensification of poaching as well. As a matter of fact, a few weeks ago, I was actually in the Philippines doing some diving, and every single dive site that I visited, the local dive guides described how since the beginning of the pandemic, illegal dynamite fishing had increased significantly. And I actually saw evidence myself of this dynamite fishing while I was in the water. But it's not just global tourism, of course. During the pandemic, humans' use of single-use plastics increased dramatically, especially our use of personal protective equipment, which has meant more pollution and animals becoming entangled and trapped in masks and gloves. And it's also the case that wild animals can be directly affected by COVID by potentially contracting the disease, and not only by contracting it, but potentially being blamed for its spread as well. At the beginning of the pandemic, bats in particular suffered from more persecution events as news stories started to break about their possible connection with the onset of COVID-19. And so those are just two groups of animals and just some examples of the ways in which they've been impacted. Of course, there are other categories of animals who suffered effects as well. Laboratory animals who have been used for the development of the COVID-19 vaccine, as well as in basic research. And also lab animals who were not directly involved in COVID-19 research. At the beginning of the pandemic, when universities had to shut down in order to meet lockdown requirements, many lab animals who were already part of ongoing research were exterminated just because there was nobody to come and care for them. And lastly, I'll just briefly touch on one more group of animals who I'm sure are near and dear to all of our hearts, but companion animals, of course, have also been affected by the pandemic. In some cases, many benefited by being adopted out of shelters or having foster homes when there otherwise might not have been. And I know my little dog Alfie appreciated all of the extra time at home with me as well. But it's also the case for some animals that having more time with humans can mean more abuse. And when humans suffer the consequences from being infected with or dying from COVID, or the financial burdens associated with lockdowns, companion animals also feel those effects as well. And so, again, that's just a very brief overview of some of these impacts, but I think what they make clear is that across and within different categories of non-human animals, the pandemic has had very significant but mixed effects. And so our response to the pandemic needs to not only seek to mitigate the pandemic's negative effects on non-human animals, but also seek to preserve and build upon its positive effects. And while our understanding of these impacts is still developing, there are some general lessons that I think we can take away now. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Jeff to talk about some of these general implications that we can learn from these impacts.
Great. Thank you so much, Lori. And thanks again to Hope and everybody for organizing this event and participating in it. So as Lori indicated, animals are part of global health and environmental threats like COVID-19, not only as causes through no fault of their own, but also as victims, both directly and indirectly. And while all of these examples focus on COVID-19 as a case study, the same is true of other modern health and environmental threats. For example, farmed animals and other captive animals and wild animals have been victims of fires and floods and heat waves and other environmental threats that we can expect to be more frequent and intense in a world reshaped by human-caused climate change. So in all of these cases, this is a reminder that, as the One Health framework notes, human, animal, and environmental health are linked. And so our attempts to promote human, animal, and environmental health ought to be linked too. And more specifically, what it means is that in addition to reducing our use of animals as part of our pandemic and climate change mitigation efforts, we also need to increase our support for animals as part of our pandemic and climate change adaptation efforts. And moreover, and this part is essential, that we need to do that for the sake of human and non-human animals, not merely for the sake of humans. And I can say a little bit more about why that part is so important and how it relates to our health and environmental policy frameworks, as well as to our thinking about rights, including the right to health. So we have a series of health and environmental policy frameworks that we use in order to wrap our heads around these emerging threats like disease outbreaks and fires and floods and the other types of disasters that are going to be more frequent and intense in a world reshaped by human activity. We have the One Health framework, the Green New Deal framework, the UN Sustainable Development Goal framework. And I can say a little bit about what each of these are, but the punchline in each case is going to be that these frameworks either ignore non-human animals or value them primarily instrumentally for the sake of human beings. And we need to strengthen and expand these frameworks so that they regard non-human animals as valuable in and of themselves. So for example, One Health is a framework that notes that human, animal, and environmental health are linked. And so our attempts to promote human, animal, and environmental health should also be linked. For example, the more we study animal health, the more we can learn about human health, and the more we improve animal health, for example, by limiting the spread of disease in non-human populations, the more we can then limit the spread of disease to human populations. But these examples are instrumentalizing of other animals in that they focus on benefits humans can receive while neglecting benefits that the non-humans themselves can receive. And when we view animal health as valuable for the sake of humans, we can miss opportunities, easy, low-hanging fruit opportunities to improve human and non-human health at the same time. We can easily end up harming or neglecting non-human animals unnecessarily. And so by simply strengthening and expanding One Health so that we attempt to improve human, animal, and environmental health for the sake of humans and other animals, we can find co-beneficial policy ideas that will improve human and non-human lives at the same time. And I can give some examples in a minute. But first, let me note how these other frameworks are similar. The Green New Deal notes the connections between social and economic and environmental justice. It notes that pandemics and climate change are threat multipliers in the sense that they not only introduce new threats, but they also increase ordinary threats like hunger and thirst and job insecurity and housing insecurity and food insecurity and all of these threats that people already face. And so they disproportionately impact the most vulnerable among us who are already at risk in some of these respects. And so what the Green New Deal framework recognizes, to its credit, is that in order to build resilience against pandemics and climate change and other threats like that, we also need to build resilience against all of the ordinary threats that these novel threats are going to amplify by increasing access to resilience with respect to food and water and housing and income and so on and so forth. But once again, the Green New Deal makes no reference to non-human animals at all, except insofar as it references biodiversity and habitats as valuable, again, for the sake of human populations. So animals are left out of this picture. And then similarly, the Sustainable Development Goals. These are international targets that once again are linking social and economic and environmental justice by saying, here are some things that the international community can do. Here are some goals that the international community can pursue in order to allow all nations to develop and lift themselves out of poverty and meet the needs of their people without harming the environment unnecessarily in the process. This is crucial, this is important, and we need to consider it in the context of international injustice and inequality. That part is important too. But once again, in the 169 targets referenced in the current version of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, some of them reference biodiversity and habitat, but 0 of them reference animals or animal welfare, the needs and interests of individual non-human animals, even though non-human animals are stakeholders for international environmental governance too. And so what all of this shows is that we have powerful frameworks for grappling with these global issues. They note that human and animal and environmental health are linked, and that social and economic and environmental justice are linked. But they do all of that only in the service of helping and saving humans, even though human and non-human animals alike are stakeholders. So by simply strengthening and expanding these frameworks so that they recognize that non-human animals are stakeholders too, we can, again, find all kinds of new ways to improve human and non-human lives at the same time. So some of the other panelists have already mentioned important changes we can make to the food system, phasing down industrial animal agriculture and phasing up humane, healthful, and sustainable plant-based alternatives. We can also make similar changes to our research system, other systems that exploit and exterminate animals unnecessarily. But then we can also find ways to help animals, to assist them, because they are now increasingly vulnerable because of human-caused global health and environmental threats. So for example, when we improve our education systems, we can include more education about these connections between human, animal, and environmental health and well-being. And we can train people to care for animals rather than harm them. When we create new green jobs as part of our just transition systems, when we help people transition away from jobs in harmful industries in the food, energy, and transportation sectors, we can create new jobs that involve caring for animals, rescuing animals, caring for the environment, for natural systems, so that people can be trained to help animals, help nature, instead of harming animals and harming nature. When we create new infrastructures, new cities, and transportation systems that are more energy efficient, We can also require that they be more animal friendly. We can require that new buildings not only be better about energy, but also have bird friendly glass to reduce collisions that harm humans and other animals, or that new transportation systems have overpasses and underpasses and wildlife corridors that once again reduce collisions that harm humans and other animals at the same time. These are the kinds of low-hanging fruit opportunities that we can easily pursue and that are co-beneficial if only someone in the room remembers that animals are stakeholders in global health and environmental policy too. So strengthening and expanding these frameworks to include humans and other animals can help us prevent a lot of harm and do a lot of good. But there is a deeper point to be made here too, and it will be my final point, and then I can turn back to Hope. The deeper point to be made is that there will be a limit to how much we can reduce harm to animals and increase support for animals in a system where animals are treated as objects, property, and commodities under the law. Right now, humans are regarded as legal persons with the capacity for legal rights that are appropriate given our individual interests and needs and relationships. But non-human animals, in most jurisdictions for the most part, are legally classified as objects. They have no capacity for rights according to the law, which makes them vulnerable to all kinds of horrific abuse and neglect. And so in addition to thinking about animal health and welfare, in addition to including animals as stakeholders in health and environmental policy frameworks like One Health, like the Green New Deal, like the Sustainable Development Goals, we need to think as a population about what the basic, fundamental, legal and political status of non-human animals should be. Yesterday, there was a historic trial. The New York Court of Appeals heard a case on behalf of Happy the elephant, who has lived, for the most part, on her own at the Bronx Zoo for decades. This is the highest court in an English-speaking jurisdiction hearing a non-human rights case for the first time in history. So the world is changing. People are starting to think and talk about these issues more right now. But we will not be able to fundamentally address the problems that humans and other animals face until we create legal and political frameworks that extend all sentient beings, everyone with the ability to consciously experience pleasure and pain, to have emotional states, to have meaningful relationships with others, until our legal and political frameworks extend all such beings rights that are appropriate given their interests and needs and vulnerabilities. And that is not to say that we all need to have the same rights, that I should have the same rights as a chimpanzee or as a dog or as an ant. It is rather to say that when you think about what we individually need and want, we should have rights that speak to those interests and needs. And one interest and need that is shared across species is an interest in health and flourishing. And so while my right should be different from a squirrel's right should be different from a worm's in all kinds of ways, one right that every sentient being can and should share is a right to health, understood as a right to the degree practicable and possible, have your basic health needs met so that you can seek out opportunities for flourishing in life. And I'll stop there and kick it back to Hope. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Jeff. And I'm so glad you mentioned the trial for Happy, who we all hope can live up to their name someday. Your comments about the importance of individuals, of their needs, of their interests, including not only humans, but non-human animals, is a great segue for Sid. In the final paper of the Health and Human Rights Journal section on ecological justice and the right to health, Sid, you examined a critical question that lies at the heart of many of the other papers and what we've been talking about tonight. Who matters? Who matters enough to warrant a right to health and all the other rights that determine health? And what are our moral obligations that follow to others, to human beings, to non-human beings, to ensure a right to health and to ensure ecological justice? Can you say a little bit more about that as you did in your paper?
Sure. Thank you, Hope. And thanks everyone else for your terrific talks. I'm going to talk a little bit here about moral rights and moral responsibilities. So a lot of humans and also non-human animals have been considered what are in philosophy sometimes called marginal cases, who are on the contested edges of moral considerability and concern. And the marginalization of humans and other species is frequently the pretext for denying their rights. And that includes rights to health care, to reproductive freedom, to bodily autonomy, and just the rights to live and not to be harmed or killed. And the marginalization of both humans and non-humans is often justified by their characteristics or their traits and abilities, or by the absence of certain characteristics, traits, and abilities. So, for example, it's frequently argued that non-human animals lack the right kind of rationality or cognition required to be moral agents, and therefore they cannot themselves matter morally. They can't have moral status. They simply don't matter. And human beings who consider themselves superior in that regard can use them any way that they please. But of course, some humans are also marginalized on the basis of sex or gender or race or geographic origin or disability. Some humans with cognitive or developmental disabilities are also said to lack the right kind of rationality or cognition. And for those who think that that's what really matters, those marginalized humans don't really matter. And that's how human supremacy is used to oppress both humans and other animals in very similar ways often. Now, there's pretty broad disagreement about what exactly are the criteria for having moral status and for mattering morally, being someone who's entitled to moral treatment and someone who has rights. There is, however, pretty broad agreement across cultural and philosophical traditions about the capacities and the responsibilities of moral agents. And moral agents have responsibilities to respect the rights of others. And they have those responsibilities because they are capable of recognizing and acting on those responsibilities. And that's because they have power and freedom. Since we know what it takes to be a moral agent, we can adopt a really inclusive and expansive way of thinking about moral status and situate it not in the characteristics or capacities of marginalized individuals, but instead in terms of the responsibilities and the obligations of moral agents. And this also recognizes that when someone is marginalized, that it's a moral agent who's responsible for marginalizing them, for denying or taking away their freedom, for denying or taking away their power, or denying and taking away their rights. Even more expansive and inclusive, and recognize that it's not just individual humans who are moral agents, but also collectives of humans. And I think this is helpful because the problems that are facing the world, the ones we've been talking about today, pandemics and climate change, the lack of access to healthcare and clean air and water, cannot be solved by individual actions alone. They require collective action, including actions by large entities like corporations and governments. The solutions to these problems are often framed as matters of individual risk and choice. So get vaccinated, wear a mask if you feel like it, drive an electric car, recycle, save water. They situate responsibility for solving these vast global problems in individual agents. But this neglects the way that these problems are not merely problems of self-interest, but are societal and global and intergenerational and interspecies moral problems for which we have a collective moral responsibility to do something. And the way that these problems are caused is, of course, not by individual actions, but by our collective actions, including the actions of governments and corporations. So an obvious example is energy companies that actively resist policies that would help combat climate change, or governments that refuse to recognize and enact universal health care or regulations that would ensure clean air and water, or as Elan and Delcy mentioned, regulations that would actually prevent some of the most egregious harms to animals in slaughterhouses. And it's important not to overlook the way that those collective entities can have moral and not merely financial, commercial, and political responsibilities. So in other words, collective entities like corporations, like governments, can be and are moral agents with moral responsibilities that transcend financial and political expediency. And those collective entities are moral agents because they have some of the same traits that other moral agents, individual moral agents have. They have power, they have freedom, and they have the capacity to recognize and act on the demands of morality and to acknowledge and respect the rights of others. So expanding who we think about as moral agents correspondingly expands moral responsibility for respecting rights and fostering the conditions for health and well-being for humans and animals onto those collective entities who uniquely have the capacity to do something about these global scale health threats like global pandemics and human-caused climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Sid, and thank you all so much for all of your thoughtful insights and your suggested solutions and ways to move forward. We already have some questions that I'd like to go ahead and go to. The first actually comes to you, Sid, and it's from Lenore Hitchler. I hope that I'm saying your name right. For Sid, what can you tell me about the brain and climate change and fossil fuels for that matter?
Okay, well, we know that there are environmental toxins out there that can affect the brain. So lead pollution is an obvious example of an environmental toxin that directly affects the brain. Leaded gasoline used to be a major source of environmental lead pollution, but today we see it in many communities, and especially poorer communities in the US who have water that's polluted with lead. It's a neurotoxin for which there's no safe amount. It's especially harmful to the developing brains of children, and it can cause irreparable harms to the developing brains of children. We also know that disasters like wildfires and the air pollution that they cause are harmful to human and animal health, and in particular to the health of children and other vulnerable persons. COVID and long COVID, which we are only beginning to explore what the long-lasting harms of those might be, including harms to brain health and to brain functioning. And we don't know what the effects of the stress of this pandemic on all of us is ultimately doing to all of us in terms of our health either. But finally, I think one of the most direct effects of climate change on the brain will be from things like the ongoing stress and anxiety and grief experienced by people, by communities, by societies, as well as by wild animals who are displaced by climate change, displaced by rising seawater or by natural disasters that destroy their homes and their habitats. And we know that those kinds of chronic stressors can actually change the brain and result in impaired functioning. And one example that we have seen really clearly, and Happy the elephant, I'm glad that you've mentioned that, because animals who are held captive in zoos, who are chronically stressed by living in inappropriate and restrictive environments, engage in self-harm. They engage in stereotypies, these harmful repetitive movements. And we also know that their brains are literally damaged by the chronic stress of the environmental deprivations that they experience. So I don't think it's a stretch to think that wild living animals and humans will be harmed in similar ways by some of the impacts of climate change, including the displacement and the disasters that are going to occur. Thank you. That was an interesting question.
That's fascinating. Fascinating response too, Sid. You know, one of the things that came up earlier, and then we'll get to some of the other questions that are being submitted. is this tension, is about this tension. Even though there's overlap between various approaches you all have described, there's also this tension between needing and wanting to be aspirational and true to our values, while at the same time working within systems that don't always uphold those values. And of course, this is a problem we see across the push for social, environmental, and ecological justice. Delcy, you pointed to this tension earlier in your comments, and I just wondered if you could speak a little bit more to that, and maybe others have thoughts as well.
Absolutely. It's a tension I live and breathe every day and have for many years. I went to law school not because I love the law or the power of the state, quite to the contrary. I went to law school because I'm a pragmatist, and I saw the law currently being used to facilitate exploitation and thought that that could be turned on its head and that we could use it to force the exploiters to start internalizing some of their costs and to try and reduce some of the mind-boggling amount of suffering that is happening in the world today, both for humans and non-humans. And so I often tell my students, because at Vermont Law School, we have very mission-driven students who are coming to law school with a specific vision and goal to change the world, that I'm teaching them to use the master's tools, and there are inherent tensions there. And so I think the most important thing to do is to be mindful about the fact that that is what we're doing, and to never lose sight of it, and to recognize that we're engaged in harm reduction. We're trying to create some change that we can see in the near term, but that we're also laying a foundation for a fundamentally different future, and to always try to have those two things in balance. And that's why I think things like transparency can play such an important role, because getting access to information, bringing more stakeholders to the table, all of those sorts of processes are going to help us get to a future where we've not only reduced the harm, but we're able to fundamentally shift our relationships. So that's some of how I grapple with this, but it's an ongoing process.
I think it's difficult for all of us, for many of the people who are joining us today too. Mia, did you have some thoughts you wanted to share about that as well? That tension?
Yeah, that's great. It's an important question. Thanks to whoever asked it, and Delcy, you expressed it very well. But just to say, I think for many of working in, across sectors, right, with environmentalists, with people who work on social justice, interest in animals and sort of a just one health approach might not be their orientation. But what I've found is, one, it's important in many ways to try to raise those issues in the context of discussions, or try to push discussions a bit. And I have also found, obviously oversimplifying it, many years of work in many different situations, but that sometimes by bringing those issues or asking those questions or talking about expanding a framework, there are more people who are open to that than we might think. And Jeff brought up the issue of the Sdgs and animal welfare, and there are groups working on that. And my experience as both someone who comes from, doing a lot of international work earlier in my career, and then an environmentalist and an animal rights person and an ethical vegan, is that there's more openness to these kind of collaborations, and many of us have talked about that. And I think that's a credit to the work that's been done in the last, 30 years, 50 years, beyond that. Hope mentioned Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson also wrote The Introduction to Animal Factories by Ruth Harrison, which was one of the first books on industrial animal agriculture and factory farming. And she tends to get left out of history, as we know sometimes women do. So I actually think there's more openness to these issues and more potential for collaboration, more actual collaboration. But I agree with Delcy and others that there is a tension, because you feel like you don't want to refer to animals as not subjects of a life. You don't want to accept a certain amount of slaughter because, oh well, not everyone's going to be vegan right away. But I actually think that there's more resonance around these issues in many different contexts. And so I think it's important that many of us are in those rooms and are in those discourses and commissions and pushing these perspectives.
Thank you, Mia. There's another really great question coming in. Considering, and this is from Diana Hewlett. Diana, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Considering that we are essentially imagining a new paradigm for how we are in relationship with other than human animals, what are your thoughts on the importance of spirituality and religion in this work? Want to take that one?
Sure, I can say something about that. Great question. So often when we talk about law and policy, we talk about those in secular terms because law and policy are meant to exist, at least, in liberal democracies, in a multicultural society with some religious and some non-religious people. But we also need to have frameworks and narratives that can situate these beliefs, these values, these practices in the systems that people actually accept and lead their lives in accordance with. And for that reason, I think it actually is really important, given that religious and spiritual views are so prevalent in society. It is really important to engage with those views because if people can find these beliefs and values and practices in those views, then that will make the animal and environmental health and well-being and rights and justice issues that we want to be exploring, that'll make that so much powerful. But the other thing to note is that if we as people in the animal or environmental movements want to go about that kind of work in the right way and are not ourselves part of those religious traditions, then there are more and less effective ways to support the right kinds of changes and progress in those traditions, namely supporting work already being done by cultural and religious insiders in those traditions to promote those issues, rather than as outsiders to go into those communities and tell people this is how you should interpret your own scripture and this is how you should interpret and update your own practices. Because in all cases, there are people in all of the major religions and all major cultures, really. I mean, I can't speak for every culture, but in many, there are people who are advocating for novel, updated interpretations of their practices and traditions and worldviews that are consistent with modern understandings of human and animal rights and justice. And so simply using whatever positions that we have to divert resources to those people, to platform them so that their views can be more salient, is a really useful way of showing that all of these different traditions can in fact be made compatible with animal environmental issues. And that will tend to go over much better and be much more effective and ethical than us trying to tell people how they should understand their own worldviews. So I think that engagement is essential, but also has to be done in the right kind of indirect, supportive way for outsiders in order to be successful.
Yeah, respect is so key to all of the things that we're talking about today. Delcy, there's a question coming in from Barbara J. King for you. For those of us who already don't eat meat or products from factory farms and want to support the creation of a federal regulatory oversight commission with One Health plus Justice, what can we do individually to help? And great talk, thank you, she says.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you for being here. Yeah, there's a lot that those of us who've chosen to opt out of supporting this industry can still do and need to still do, because I think it's important to understand that Americans are eating more animals per capita than ever before in history. And that's despite the tremendous success that plant-based and other alternatives are having on the market. And a big reason that we are seeing this increased number of animals factory farmed and killed is because of the way we regulate, or more accurately, do not regulate slaughterhouses. Because the market for meat and poultry products is so elastic that the more we produce and the cheaper it is, Americans are just consuming more of it, and we're also exporting it around the world. And so what can we do? We can reach out to our members of Congress and urge them to support an idea like this. And I think also just start expressing support for it publicly. Elan and I wrote this piece. It's a pretty short essay that we wrote for the journal, and it was kind of a think piece to sort of just pull together the framework of the idea and put it out there in the world and see how it went, see what kind of response it got. And now that we're starting to talk about it, I'm starting to think in more concrete detail about, what would this look like? How would we structure a framework to ensure that there isn't capture, that the various interests are adequately represented? And so I think the next step, and I haven't talked about this, Elan, but I think we're going to have to write a follow-up piece. So I hope you're on board with me, is to really sketch it out in more detail and then get it in front of some lawmakers and get them to do this. And this shouldn't be, oftentimes this sort of approach of studying an issue, making recommendations is sort of the alternative that you get when you don't get what you really want. So, for example, 2 decades ago, when folks were pushing for the ending the slaughter of downed livestock, they didn't get a ban on it. They got a recommendation that it be studied. And if there aren't really firm deadlines and things like that, it can languish, as has been in the case there. But if you put in really clear enforcement mechanisms, it can be meaningful. Timelines for reports, for next steps. And so I think really hashing that out is the next step. But knowing that there is support for this idea is really great. And I think as we move forward, we will need to leverage that, and members of Congress will be needing to hear from their constituents that there's support for it.
Thank you, Delcy. You're touching on something that others have touched on, this interplay of supply and demand, and our relationship with supply and demand. And I just wondered if any of you have any ideas about how we can use that framework, the supply side and the demand side, to intervene and to push for more ecological justice and the right to health, both for people and animals in real time, or human and non-human beings in real time.
I don't have great ideas about this. I wish I could say that I did, but one idea that you hear about a lot when people complain about gas prices, for example, is that in the U.S. actually we pay a lot less for gasoline than people in other countries do, for example, in Europe, and the idea that harmful products that we buy should come with a surcharge, right? There should be this a tax on them. I mean, anyone who's a vegan knows that you always pay the vegan surcharge to get vegan food in a restaurant or something like that. But when we're talking about products that actually harm the environment, like fossil fuels, like meat production and so on, those things should cost more. And obviously, to borrow Delcy's phrase, we can use the master's tools here to sort of, throw a little capitalism at this supply and demand problem and reduce the demand by making it cost more to use things that have these harmful effects. I don't know how we do that, but I'd like to see it happen.
Delcy, did you have some thoughts as well? Oh, Jeff, sorry. Go ahead, please.
Oh, I was just going to add one thing briefly, which is that I completely agree with Sid, and I think this is one of those areas where no single issue is going to be, no single intervention is going to be a silver bullet that solves the problem by itself. And so we really need to be thinking systemically, not only about the ways that these industries cause harm, but also about the types of policy interventions that are going to address the harm. And so, it might be that, for example, taxing or full cost pricing for harmful industries, where you make them pay for the harms that they cause in a way that increase the cost, that might help, but it might not be enough by itself. And the same might be true of regulating them in a way that forbids them from causing the worst harms, or having informational policies that educate the public about these harms, or supporting plant-based and cultivated meat research and development. none of these things by itself is going to be a silver bullet. But if you do all of them together, then they can end up being mutually reinforcing, and each of them helps a little bit and makes the others more effective. And then together, they can make the kind of positive difference that we're seeking. So it would be too much to expect that cultivated meat by itself will save the day. And if you reject it simply because it won't be able to by itself save the day, you are being unfair. You should instead be asking, can it play a useful role in a broader system of interventions that collectively have the potential to save the day if we get lucky? And I think the answer to that question with respect to all of these interventions is yes.
So well said, Jeff, and a great way to help us wrap for the evening. You know, we need to deal with so many different issues on the supply and demand side: subsidies, divestment, investment in ethical, more just products. And starting, you know, the nice thing about a Just One Health framework is that it gives us a place to start, right? Whenever we have an ethical framework or an approach that we've delineated, it at least gives us some principles to start with, if the principles are well grounded. So we're unfortunately nearing the end of our evening together. On behalf of Phoenix Zones Initiative, I just want to thank all of our panelists. I could listen to them talk about these issues for hours. And thank you again to our co-sponsors and to all of you in our audience who have joined us today. I'd just like to end by sharing some words from Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, if I could. Let me just get my glasses. Through all these new, imaginative, and creative approaches to the problem of sharing our earth with other creatures, there runs a constant theme: the awareness that we are dealing with life. As we've seen here tonight, an emphasis on ecological justice could help us all claim our right to health and to life. To learn more about and to support our efforts to advance ecological justice and the right to health, please visit phoenixzonesinitiative.org, where you can also sign up for our newsletter for regular updates. On our website, you can also find ways to support our work, either through a donation or in other ways. There are many other ways to get involved. We're working on some of the very issues that were discussed tonight. For example, making sure a pandemic prevention treaty and the Sustainable Development Goals consider animals as well as particularly vulnerable human beings through a Just One Health approach. And you can learn more on our website, phoenixzonesinitiative.org. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists, and good night.